In the vast wilderness of classic literature, few tales echo with such power and depth as the one we continue tonight. Here on Echoes of Stories, a masterpiece of courage, loyalty, and survival. The Last of the Mohicans, by James Fenimore Cooper, stands as a timeless reflection of a world caught between two nations, two cultures, and two destinies. First published in 1826, this novel remains one of America's most enduring adventures, a vivid portrait of frontier life where honor and danger walk side by side. The version you're about to hear comes from the public domain archives of Project Gutenberg, preserved so that every listener may rediscover its spirit. And now, let the journey continue. This is The Last of the Mohicans, Episode 2. The scout had barely finished speaking when the leader of the approaching party stepped into view. His footsteps had already been detected by the sharp ear of the Indian. A narrow path, worn by the repeated passage of deer, wound through a small glen nearby and reached the river at the very spot where the white man and his native companions had taken their position. Along this track, the unexpected travelers advanced slowly toward the hunter, who stood ready at the front of his group to meet them. The scout rested his rifle across his left arm, his right finger still on the trigger, though his posture carried no threat. He asked who dared to appear in such a wilderness filled with beasts and dangers. The rider at the front declared that they were men of faith, loyal to the law and the king. They had traveled since sunrise through the forest without food and were weary from their long journey. The hunter observed that they must be lost, helpless in choosing the right or left path. The rider admitted it was true, comparing their dependence to that of children who could not guide themselves. He asked if the scout knew the distance to a crown post called William Henry. The scout laughed openly, though he quickly checked the sound to avoid alerting hidden enemies. He told them they were far off course, as far as a hound would be if Horican lay between him and his prey. If they were truly friends of the king and had business with the army, they should follow the river down to Edward and present their matter to Webb, who remained there, instead of pressing into the defile and attempting to drive the French back across Champlain. Before the stranger could respond, another horseman burst through the bushes and leaped into the pathway ahead of his companion. This new rider asked how far they were from Fort Edward, since they had left it that very morning and were bound for the head of the lake. The scout replied that they must have lost their sight before losing their way, for the road across the portage was broad and clear, as fine a path as any in London or even before the king's palace. Heyward, who was indeed the second rider, smiled and said it was enough to admit that they had trusted an Indian guide who promised a shorter but less certain route, and that they had been deceived. In truth, they no longer knew where they were. The scout shook his head in disbelief at the thought of an Indian lost in the woods. The sun marked the treetops, the streams ran full, and the moss on every beach revealed the direction of the North Star. Deer paths led to streams and salt licks, places known to all. Even the geese had not yet finished their flight to Canada. It seemed impossible that an Indian could lose his way between Horican and the bend in the river. He asked if the guide was a Mohawk. The answer came that the man was not Mohawk by birth, though adopted into that tribe, and was in fact a Huron. At this, the scout's two companions, who had sat motionless until now, sprang to their feet with sudden energy. The scout repeated the word Huron with distrust, calling them a thievish race who could never be made into anything but vagabonds. He wondered that the travelers had not already fallen into greater danger. The rider insisted there was little risk, since William Henry lay many miles ahead, and reminded the scout that their guide now served as a Mohawk and a friend to their forces. The scout, however, declared firmly that one born a Mingo would always remain a Mingo. For honesty, he would trust a Delaware or a Mohican. And when it came to fighting, though not all would do so, the true warrior was to be found among the Delawares or the Mohicans. Heyward grew impatient and pressed the scout to end the debate. He explained that he had no wish to question the character of a man he already knew, especially one who was a stranger to the scout. What mattered was the distance to the main army at Edward. The scout replied that such a distance might depend on who guided them, adding that a horse of such strength should have covered much ground between sunrise and sunset. Heyward softened his tone, restraining his dissatisfaction. He asked the scout to tell him the distance to Fort Edward and to lead them there, promising that his effort would not go unrewarded. The scout hesitated, questioning how he could be certain he was not guiding an enemy or a spy of Montcalm into the works of the army. He reminded them that not every man who spoke English was a loyal subject. Heyward countered that if the scout truly served with the troops, he must know of the king's regiment called the 60th. The scout admitted that he knew much of the Royal Americans, even if he wore a hunting shirt instead of a scarlet jacket. Heyward pressed further, asking if he knew the name of its major. The hunter straightened with pride, declaring that if anyone knew Major Effingham, it was he. Heyward clarified that the Corps had many majors, and he spoke of the junior officer who commanded the companies at William Henry. The scout acknowledged hearing of a young gentleman from the southern provinces, wealthy and perhaps too young for such rank, yet reputed to be both knowledgeable in war and gallant in spirit. Heyward revealed that this officer now stood before him, proving he could not be an enemy. The scout looked at Heyward with surprise, lifting his cap and speaking with less confidence, though doubts still lingered. He asked if a party had indeed left the encampment that morning for the lakeshore. Heyward confirmed it, explaining that he had chosen a nearer route, trusting the Indian guide he had mentioned earlier. The scout asked if the guide had deceived and deserted them. Heyward replied that he believed neither was true, for the man remained in the rear. The scout expressed a desire to see the guide, claiming he could recognize a true Iroquois by his look and paint. He stepped past Heyward's charger and moved along the path behind the singing master's mare, whose foal had paused to nurse. Pushing aside the bushes, he came upon the women, who waited anxiously for the outcome of the discussion. Behind them, the runner leaned against a tree, enduring the scout's close inspection with an unmoved air, though his dark and savage expression was enough to stir unease. Satisfied, the scout turned back. As he passed the women, he paused to admire their beauty, returning Alice's smile and nod with open pleasure. He then studied the rider of the mare briefly, but finding nothing, he shook his head and returned to Heyward. The scout declared firmly that a Mingo would always remain a Mingo, no matter what tribe claimed him. If they were alone, and Heyward was willing to abandon his fine horse to the wolves, he could lead them to Edward within an hour, for it was not far. But with the ladies present, such a journey was impossible. Heyward argued that the women were tired, but still capable of riding a few more miles. The scout rejected the idea, calling it a natural impossibility. He would not walk a mile in those woods after nightfall with that runner as a companion, not even for the best rifle in the colonies. The forest was filled with lurking Iroquois, and the Mohawk guide knew too well where to find them. Heyward leaned forward in his saddle, lowering his voice to a near whisper. He admitted to himself that he had long carried suspicions about the guide, though he had tried to hide them for the sake of his companions. He had even pretended to feel a confidence that was not always real. It was precisely because of these doubts that he had refused to follow the man further, forcing the guide instead to follow behind. The scout, with a cautious gesture, signaled that he had recognized the deception from the very first glance. He pointed out the figure leaning against the foot of a sugar sapling, the right leg aligned with the bark of the tree. Tapping his rifle, he explained that he could strike the man cleanly between the angle and the knee with a single shot, ending his wandering for weeks to come. Yet he added that if he approached openly, the cunning runner would sense danger and vanish into the trees like a startled deer. Heyward resisted the idea, uneasy with the thought of harming someone who might still be innocent. He admitted, however, that he had strong reasons to believe the man had deceived him. The scout, acting almost by instinct, raised his rifle again, declaring that it was always safe to assume treachery from an Iroquois. Heyward stopped him firmly, insisting that another plan must be found. The hunter abandoned his first intention and called his two Mohican companions to his side with a quick gesture. They spoke in low tones, using the Delaware language, while the scout pointed toward the sapling to indicate the hidden enemy's position. The Mohicans understood at once. Setting aside their firearms, they slipped silently into the thicket on opposite sides of the path, moving with such care that not a sound betrayed their steps. The scout then instructed Heyward to return and keep the guide occupied in conversation, while the Mohicans captured him without disturbing his war paint. Heyward, proud and determined, declared that he would seize the man himself. The scout warned him sharply that, mounted as he was, he could do little against an Indian hidden in the bushes. Heyward offered to dismount, but the scout reminded him that the runner would never wait for both feet to be free of the stirrups. In the forest, one had to use native methods to succeed. He urged Heyward to speak openly to the man, pretending to trust him as the truest friend he had on earth. Heyward prepared to obey, though he felt deep disgust at the task he was forced to perform. With every passing moment, he realized more clearly the danger into which his misplaced confidence had drawn those entrusted to his care. The sun had already set, and the forest, suddenly deprived of its light, grew dim and shadowed. The gathering dusk reminded him that the hour favored by the savage for his most merciless acts of vengeance was quickly approaching. Driven by this fear, he left the scout, who at once began a loud conversation with a stranger that had so boldly joined their party earlier that morning. As Heyward passed his gentler companions, he spoke a few words of encouragement. He was relieved to see that, though weary from the day's exertion, they suspected nothing more than an accidental delay. Believing he was merely consulting about the route ahead, they remained calm. Heyward spurred his horse forward and stopped within a few yards of the sullen runner, who still leaned against a tree. With forced confidence, he reminded the guide that night was closing in, yet they were no nearer to William Henry than when they had left Webb's camp at sunrise. Heyward explained that both he and the guide had missed the way. Fortune, however, had brought them to a hunter, the very man now speaking with the singing master. This hunter knew the deer paths and hidden tracks of the forest and had promised to lead them to a safe resting place until morning. The Indian fixed his glowing eyes on Heyward and asked if the hunter was alone. Heyward, unpracticed in deception, hesitated before replying that the man was not alone, for they themselves were with him. The runner calmly lifted his small wallet and declared that Le Renard Subtle would go, leaving the pale faces to their own kind. Heyward, startled, asked who bore that name. The Indian answered with pride that it was the title given him by his Canadian fathers. Night, he added, was the same as day to Le Subtle, especially when Munro awaited him. Heyward pressed further, asking what account Le Renard would give to the fiery Scotsman if his daughters were left unguided, despite Magua's promise. The runner replied coldly that the gray head might have a loud voice and a long arm, but neither would reach him in the woods. Heyward warned that the Mohawks would scorn such betrayal, forcing him into women's garments and confining him to the wigwam. The runner remained unmoved, saying only that Le Subtle knew the path to the Great Lakes and could find the bones of his fathers. Heyward urged him to remember their friendship, asking why there should be bitterness between them. Munro had promised him a reward for his service, and Heyward himself would add another. He urged Magua to rest, open his wallet, and eat so that when the ladies were refreshed, they could continue their journey. The Indian muttered in his own tongue that pale faces made themselves slaves to their women, forcing warriors to lay aside their weapons to feed them. When asked what he had said, he replied simply that it was good, Fixing his eyes sharply on Heyward's open face, he quickly turned them away, then seated himself on the ground. He drew out the remains of an earlier meal and began to eat, though not without casting slow, cautious glances around him. Heyward, watching, declared that this was well, for Renard would then have strength and sight to find the path in the morning. He paused suddenly at the sound of a snapping twig and rustling leaves from the nearby bushes. Recovering himself, he added that they must move before sunrise, or Montcalm might block their way and cut them off from the fortress. Magua's hand dropped from his mouth to his side. Though his eyes remained fixed on the ground, his head turned slightly, his nostrils widened, and his ears seemed to sharpen, giving him the appearance of a statue carved to represent absolute attention. Heyward, watching closely, slipped one foot from the stirrup while his hand moved toward the bearskin covering of his holsters. He studied the runner's movements with vigilance, but every attempt to discover the object of Magua's focus was defeated. The man's eyes trembled with restless glances that never settled on one point, yet hardly seemed to move at all. As Heyward hesitated, Lusuttle slowly rose to his feet. His motion was so cautious and deliberate that not the faintest sound betrayed the change. Heyward realized the moment had come for action. He swung his leg over the saddle and dismounted, resolved to seize the treacherous guide and trust the outcome to his own strength. Still, he maintained an outward air of calmness and friendship, hoping to avoid unnecessary alarm. He addressed Magua with a name that flattered the man's vanity, remarking that he did not eat, that his corn seemed dry and poorly parched, and offering to search his own provisions for something more suitable. Magua extended the wallet without hesitation, allowing their hands to meet. He betrayed no emotion, his posture still fixed in rigid attention. But when Heyward's fingers brushed lightly along his bare arm, the runner suddenly struck upward, knocking aside the young officer's limb. With a piercing cry, Magua darted beneath the arm and bounded into the opposite thicket in a single leap. At that instant, Chingachgook emerged from the bushes, his painted form gliding across the path like a specter in pursuit. A shout from Uncas followed, and then the forest was lit by a sudden flash, accompanied by the sharp crack of the hunter's rifle. The sudden flight of the guide, joined with the wild cries of the pursuers, left Heyward motionless in surprise for several moments. Then, recalling the importance of securing the fugitive, he pushed aside the bushes and hurried forward, eager to join the chase. Yet before he had gone 100 yards, he encountered the three foresters already returning from their unsuccessful pursuit. Heyward urged them not to give up so quickly. He insisted that the traitor must be hiding behind the trees and could still be captured, for their safety was at risk while he remained free. The scout, however, compared such an effort to setting a cloud to chase the wind. He explained that he had heard the fugitive brushing over the dry leaves like a black snake. He had even caught a glimpse of him near a large pine and fired as if following his scent. But the shot had failed. For all his experience, he admitted that even a well-aimed attempt could miss. To prove his point, he showed a sumac whose leaves were red, though its fruit would not appear until July. Heyward believed the red stain to be the blood of Lusuttle and declared that the man might yet fall. The scout disagreed firmly. He admitted he might have only scraped the bark of a limb, for the fugitive had leaped with even greater speed afterward. A rifle ball, he explained, when it merely grazes a running animal, acts like a spur on a horse. It quickens the motion and gives life to the flesh instead of taking it away. Only when it tears a deep wound does the leaping soon come to an end, whether the target be Indian or deer. Heyward reminded them that they were 4 strong men against 1 wounded fugitive. The scout interrupted sharply, asking if life was so little valued. He warned that the cunning enemy would lure them within reach of his comrades' tomahawks before they had even warmed to the chase. It was reckless, he added, for a man so used to sleeping with a war whoop in his ears to fire his weapon within sound of an ambush. Yet he admitted the temptation had been natural, almost irresistible. The scout then urged his companions to shift their position. They must move in such a way as to mislead the cunning of the Mingo. Otherwise, he warned, their scalps would be drying in the wind before Montcalm's tent by the very next evening. The chilling declaration of the scout, spoken with the calm assurance of one who understood the danger yet did not fear it, reminded Heyward of the heavy responsibility he carried. He cast his eyes around, straining in vain to pierce the deepening gloom beneath the forest arches. A dreadful thought pressed upon him, that his defenseless companions might soon be left to the mercy of ruthless enemies, who, like beasts of prey, waited only for the cover of darkness to strike with deadly certainty. His imagination, sharpened by fear, deceived him at every turn. Each swaying bush or broken tree seemed to take the shape of a human form. Again and again, he fancied he saw the hideous faces of lurking foes, watching with tireless vigilance for the slightest movement of his party. Looking upward, he noticed that the thin clouds, once tinted faintly with evening's rose, had already lost their color. The stream that glided past their station could now be traced only by the dark outline of its wooded banks. Overcome by doubt and helplessness, Heyward cried out in desperation. He begged his companions not to desert him, but to remain and defend those entrusted to his care. He even promised that they might freely name their reward. Yet the Mohicans, speaking softly in their own tongue, paid little attention to his appeal. Their low voices, scarcely above a whisper, carried tones of debate. Heyward could distinguish the earnest urgency of the younger warrior from the measured words of his elders. It was clear they were weighing a decision that deeply concerned the safety of the travelers. Impatient with the delay, Heyward drew closer, intending to make his offers of compensation more definite. At that moment, the white scout raised his hand, as though conceding the point in dispute. Turning away, he spoke aloud in English, declaring that Uncas was right. It would not be the act of men to abandon such helpless beings to their fate, even if it meant losing their hiding place forever. If the travelers were to be saved from the fangs of the worst serpents, there was no time to waste and no room for hesitation. Heyward protested that such a wish could not be doubted, reminding them of his earlier offers. The scout interrupted calmly, urging him instead to offer prayers for wisdom to outwit the cunning devils of the forest. Money, he said, was useless, for Heyward might not live to pay it, nor he to profit by it. The Mohicans, and he would do all that human thought could devise to protect such delicate flowers, never meant for the wilderness, from harm. They would do so without hope of reward, except the recompense God grants to upright deeds. But first, Heyward must promise two things, both for himself and his companions, or else their service would only bring harm. Heyward noticed the impatient gesture of the scout through the deepening shadows of evening, and quickly followed in his steps toward the place where the rest of the party had been left. When they rejoined the anxious women, he explained briefly the conditions set by their new guide and the urgent need for silence and immediate exertion. Though his words filled the listeners with secret fear, his earnest manner, combined with the gravity of the danger, gave them strength to endure the unexpected trial. Without hesitation, they allowed him to help them from their saddles. They moved swiftly to the water's edge, where the scout had gathered the others, guided more by his gestures than by words. The scout muttered to himself about the difficulty of dealing with the horses. He reasoned that killing them would waste time, while leaving them behind would reveal to the Mingos that their owners were close at hand. Heyward suggested releasing the animals with their bridles and letting them wander freely in the woods. The scout rejected the idea, deciding instead that it would be wiser to mislead their enemies, making them believe they must match the speed of horses to overtake the chase. As he spoke, a sudden rustling in the bushes caught his attention. It was only the colt, yet the scout declared that the young animal must die. He reached for its mane, but the nimble creature slipped from his grasp. Calling on Uncas for his arrows, he prepared to end the matter. The owner of the foal cried out in protest, begging for its life, describing it as the innocent offspring of a faithful dam. The scout silenced him sternly, warning that in a struggle for survival, even fellow men became no more than beasts of the forest. He threatened to abandon the speaker to the mercy of the Maguas if he interfered again. The scout's low, threatening tone still lingered when the foal reared on its hind legs and then fell to its knees. Chingachgook met it swiftly, his knife cutting across its throat in an instant. The struggling animal was thrust into the river, where it drifted away with audible gasps as life ebbed from its body. To the travelers, this act seemed cruel, yet they recognized it as a grim necessity. The scene struck them as a dreadful warning of the peril surrounding them, made even more chilling by the calm determination of those who carried it out. The sisters shuddered and clung to each other, while Heyward instinctively drew one of his pistols and placed himself between his charges and the darkening forest. The Mohicans wasted no time. Taking the bridles, they led the frightened and reluctant horses into the river. At a short distance from the shore, they turned and were soon hidden by the curve of the bank. Beneath its shadow, they moved in the opposite direction of the current, their figures quickly lost from sight. Meanwhile, the scout drew a bark canoe from its hiding place beneath low bushes that bent with the eddies of the stream. He motioned silently for the women to enter. They obeyed without hesitation, though their eyes often turned back with fearful glances toward the thickening gloom, which now hung like a dark barrier along the edge of the river. Once Cora and Alice were seated, the scout directed Heyward to support one side of the fragile canoe while he steadied the other. Without hesitation, they bore it against the current, followed closely by the sorrowful owner of the slain foal. In silence they advanced for many rods, the stillness broken only by the rippling of the water around them or the faint splash of their cautious steps. Heyward surrendered the guidance of the vessel entirely to the scout, who shifted nearer or farther from the shore with practiced ease, avoiding rocks and deeper channels as though the path were familiar to him. At times the scout would halt, listening with painful intensity. The dull but growing roar of the waterfall made the silence even more profound. When no sound betrayed the presence of their enemies, he resumed his slow and guarded progress. At length, Heyward's eyes fixed on a cluster of dark shapes gathered in the shadow of a high bank. The spot was darker than the rest of the river, and he hesitated, pointing it out to his companion. The scout, calm and composed, explained that the Indians had hidden the horses there with native skill. Water left no trail, and even an owl's eyes would be blinded by such darkness. The party was soon reunited, and while the scout consulted with his comrades, the others had a brief moment to observe their surroundings. The river was hemmed in by steep, jagged rocks, one of which hung directly above the resting place of the canoe. Tall trees crowned the cliffs, their limbs appearing to totter on the edge of the precipice. The stream seemed to run through a deep and narrow dell, its surface broken only by the faint outlines of branches painted against the starry sky. Behind them, the curve of the banks quickly closed the view with the same dark outline of forest. Ahead, the water appeared to rise against the heavens before plunging into hidden caverns. From those depths came the heavy, sullen sounds that had filled the evening air. The place seemed devoted to solitude, and the sisters, gazing on its wild beauty, felt a fleeting sense of safety. Yet the sudden movement of their guides recalled them from this illusion to the harsh reality of their peril. The horses had been secured to shrubs growing in the cracks of the rocks, left standing in the water to pass the night. The scout then directed Heyward and the weary travelers to sit in the forward end of the canoe, while he himself took the rear, steady and upright as though the vessel were made of stronger material. The Mohicans retraced their steps toward the place they had left. With a powerful thrust of his pole against a rock, the scout sent the frail bark into the rushing stream. For many minutes, the struggle between the light craft and the swift current was fierce and uncertain. The passengers, forbidden to stir and scarcely daring to breathe, watched the flashing waters in anxious suspense. Again and again, they thought the eddies would sweep them to destruction, but each time the steady hand of their pilot turned the bow to meet the rapid. At last, after a long and desperate effort, the struggle ended. Just as Alice covered her eyes in terror, believing they were about to be drawn into the cataract's vortex, the canoe came to rest beside a flat rock, lying level with the surface of the water. Heyward realized that the scout had ceased his exertions and asked where they were and what must be done next. The scout explained, raising his voice above the roar of the cataract, that they had reached the foot of glens. The next step was to make a steady landing, for if the canoe overturned, they would be swept back down the dangerous path they had just ascended. He warned that 5 people in such a frail vessel of bark and gum was an unnatural number to keep dry in a rush of water. He directed them to step onto the rock, promising to return with the Mohicans and the venison, reminding them that a man might better sleep without his scalp than starve in the midst of plenty. The passengers obeyed gladly. As the last foot touched the rock, the canoe spun away from its place. For an instant, the tall form of the scout was visible above the waters before vanishing into the impenetrable darkness of the riverbed. Left without their guide, the travelers stood in helpless uncertainty, afraid to move along the jagged rocks, lest a misstep send them plunging into one of the many roaring caverns where the water tumbled on every side. Their suspense was brief. With the aid of the Mohicans, the canoe soon reappeared, shooting back into the eddy and floating once more beside the low rock, sooner than they believed possible. Relieved, Heyward spoke cheerfully, declaring that they were now fortified, garrisoned, and provisioned, and could defy Montcalm and his allies. He then asked the scout if he could see anything of the Iroquois on the mainland. The scout replied that he called them Iroquois because, to him, every native who spoke a foreign tongue was an enemy, even if he pretended to serve the king. If Webb wanted honesty and loyalty in an Indian, he should call upon the Delawares. The Mohawks, the Oneidas, and the rest of the 6 nations, greedy and deceitful, belonged with the French, where nature had placed them. Heyward countered that such an exchange would only replace a warlike ally with a useless one. He had heard that the Delawares had laid aside the hatchet and were content to be called women. The scout, however, rejected this claim with indignation. He blamed the Hollanders and the Iroquois for tricking the Delawares into such a treaty. The scout declared that he had known the Delawares for 20 years and would call any man a liar who said cowardly blood ran in their veins. Their tribes had been driven from the seashore, and now their enemies spread falsehoods so others might rest easy at night. To him, every Indian who spoke a foreign tongue was an Iroquois, whether his tribe's stronghold lay in Canada or in York. Heyward, realizing that the scout's firm loyalty to his Delaware or Mohican companions would only prolong a useless debate, decided to change the subject. He shifted the conversation toward more practical matters, asking if their native allies had noticed any trace of the enemy. The scout, ever cautious and experienced, trusted his instincts more than his eyes. He explained that an Indian could often be felt before he was seen, and that when tracking the Mingos, one must rely on the senses beyond sight. He then mentioned that their horses had shown signs of fear, perhaps sensing danger nearby, like wolves that often linger around an Indian ambush, drawn by the remains of a hunter's kill. Heyward suggested that the dead colt or their fresh deer carcass might have attracted the predators. And as if in answer, a distant, haunting sound echoed through the roar of the nearby waterfall. The older traveler, deeply saddened by the loss of his animal, whispered a quiet prayer under his breath, accepting fate as it was written. The scout, observing his companion's grief, reflected that it was good for a man to feel sympathy even for a dumb creature. Such a heart, he thought, would find comfort in the belief that everything happens as it must. He then advised that they should slice what meat they needed and cast the rest into the stream before wolves followed the scent. For even the sharpest Iroquois could interpret the cry of a wolf. As he spoke, the scout gathered his tools and prepared for the task. Without another word, he and the two Mohicans moved silently toward the rock face beside the water, disappearing one by one into the darkness, as though swallowed by the cliff itself. Heyward and his female companions observed the mysterious movements of their guides with uneasiness. Though the white man's conduct had so far been above reproach, his rough equipment, blunt manner, and strong prejudices, together with the silent reserve of his companions, stirred distrust in minds already shaken by recent treachery. The stranger alone seemed indifferent to all that passed. He seated himself on a projection of the rocks, showing no sign of awareness except through the heavy sighs that betrayed the struggles of his spirit. Soon muffled voices were heard, as if men called to one another from within the earth. Suddenly a light flashed, revealing the hidden secret of the place. At the far end of a narrow cavern in the rock, its length exaggerated by perspective and the nature of the light, sat the scout holding a blazing knot of pine. The glare fell full upon his weather-beaten face and forest attire, giving him a wild, romantic air. By daylight, he would have appeared only as a man remarkable for the strangeness of his dress, the iron rigidity of his frame, and the curious blend of quick sagacity and simple honesty that alternately ruled his features. A short distance ahead stood Uncas, his figure thrown into full relief. The travelers studied the upright, flexible form of the young Mohican, graceful and unrestrained in every natural movement. His green, fringed hunting shirt concealed little of his proud bearing. His dark, fearless eyes were both calm and terrible. His high features, pure in their native red, and the noble proportions of his head, crowned with the scalping tuft, left a striking impression. For the first time, Duncan and his companions could clearly view the lineaments of their Indian attendants. Doubt lifted from their minds as they recognized in the young warrior a proud and determined spirit, incapable of wanton treachery. Alice gazed at him as though he were a living relic of ancient art, while Heyward, though familiar with the beauty of native forms, openly admired this unblemished example of manly proportions. Alice whispered that she could rest in peace with such a fearless youth as her sentinel, doubting that cruelty or torture could exist in his presence. Heyward agreed that this was a rare instance of natural greatness, though he warned against expecting virtue in any form other than that of the savage. Bright examples were rare among Christians and equally rare among Indians, but both were capable of producing them. He hoped this Mohican would prove, as his look suggested, a brave and faithful friend. Cora added that in such a being, one forgot the shade of his skin. A brief and embarrassed silence followed, broken only when the scout called them to enter. The scout explained that the fire burned too brightly and might betray them to their enemies. He ordered Uncas to drop a blanket to darken the glow. He admitted the meal was not what a major of the Royal Americans might expect, but reminded them that soldiers had often eaten venison raw without complaint. Here, at least, they had salt for a quick broil and fresh sassafras boughs for the women to sit upon, which, though humbler than their chairs at home, gave a sweeter fragrance. He urged his mourning companion not to grieve for the colt, for it had been spared many hardships, and its death had saved it from weary burdens. Uncas obeyed the direction, And when Hawkeye's voice fell silent, the roar of the cataract filled the cavern like distant thunder. Heyward, uneasy, questioned whether they were truly safe in such a retreat, pointing out that a single-armed man at the entrance could hold them all at his mercy. From the darkness behind the scout, a spectral figure emerged. Seizing a blazing brand, it lifted the light toward the far end of the cavern. Alice gave a faint cry, and even Cora arose in alarm, until Heyward reassured them that it was only Chingachgook. The Mohican raised another blanket, revealing that the cavern had 2 outlets. Carrying the torch, he crossed a narrow chasm in the rocks, open to the sky, and entered another cave that mirrored the first in every essential detail. The scout explained with a laugh that men like himself and Chingachgook were not often trapped in a burrow with only one escape. He pointed out the cunning of the place. The rock was black limestone, soft enough to serve as a pillow where brush and pine were scarce. Once, the waterfall had been just below them, a regular and handsome sheet of water, but time had changed it. The rocks had cracked, softened in places, and the water had carved deep hollows, forcing the falls to retreat hundreds of feet. Now the cascade had lost both shape and consistency. Heyward asked where they stood within this shifting scene. The scout explained that they were near the spot where Providence had first placed the falls, but the water had refused to remain. The softer rock on either side had given way, leaving the center bare and dry, and forming the 2 small caverns that now sheltered them. Heyward realized they were on an island. The scout confirmed it. The falls surrounded them on 2 sides, with the river above and below. By daylight, he said, it would be worth climbing the rock to see the strange perversity of the water. It fell without rule, leaping, tumbling, skipping, or shooting in different places. In one spot, it was white as snow, in another green as grass. Here it plunged into hollows that shook the earth. There it rippled like a brook, carving whirlpools and gullies as though the stone were soft clay. The river seemed confused, running smoothly at first as if to follow its course, then angling toward the shores, even turning back as though unwilling to leave the wilderness for the salt sea. He compared the delicate cloth at Alice's throat to the fine patterns the water created, as if it had broken free from order to try its hand at every design. Yet, he concluded, after all its wildness, the water was gathered again by the hand that made it, flowing steadily toward the sea as it had been ordained from the beginning of the earth. The listeners took comfort from his assurance of safety, though they judged the wild beauty of the place differently than he did. Still, they were in no condition to dwell on nature's charms. As the scout continued his cooking, pausing only to point with a broken fork towards some unruly part of the stream, their attention turned at last to the more pressing matter of their supper. The meal, made more welcome by a few delicacies that Heyward had wisely carried from the horses, proved exceedingly refreshing to the weary travelers. Uncas attended to the women with a mixture of dignity and anxious grace, performing small services that amused Heyward. He knew well that such acts were a complete departure from Indian custom, which forbade warriors to stoop to menial tasks, especially for women. Yet, as hospitality was sacred, this breach of tradition drew no comment. Had anyone been free to observe closely, it might have been noticed that the young Mohican's attentions were not entirely impartial. When he offered Alice the gourd of sweet water or venison neatly carved from the knot of pepperidge, his courtesy was sufficient. But when he turned to her sister, his dark eyes lingered on her expressive features with a deeper interest. At times he was forced to speak, using broken English to command attention. His words, though imperfect, were softened by a deep, musical tone that caused both sisters to look up in admiration and surprise. Through these small exchanges, a sense of friendly understanding began to form between them. Meanwhile, Chingachgook remained motionless, seated within the circle of light. The uneasy glances of the guests allowed them to separate the natural expression of his face from the fearful effect of his war paint. They saw the resemblance between father and son, altered only by age and hardship. The fierceness of his features seemed at rest, replaced by the vacant composure of a warrior whose powers were not presently required. Yet, from time to time, a sudden gleam crossed his swarthy face, showing how easily his passions could be roused to give full force to the terrifying mask he wore. The scout, in contrast, was never still. His quick, roving eyes seldom rested, even as he ate and drank with an appetite undisturbed by danger. His vigilance never left him. Again and again, the gourd or venison paused before his lips while his head turned aside, as though listening for distant, distrusted sounds. Each time, the movement recalled his companions from their momentary wonder at the novelty of their situation to the grim reality of the peril that had driven them there. These pauses, however, were never followed by explanation. The uneasiness they created soon faded, and for a time the travelers forgot their fears, content to rest in the brief calm of the cavern. As the meal drew to a close, Hawkeye drew out a small keg from beneath a cover of leaves. He offered it to the stranger seated beside him, who had shown great appreciation for his cooking. The scout encouraged him to drink, saying it would wash away thoughts of the cold and strengthen his spirits. He added that it might seal their friendship, hoping that the memory of horse flesh would leave no bitterness between them. The stranger introduced himself as David Gamut, the singing master, and prepared to ease his sorrow with a generous draught of the woodsman's strong, spiced drink. Hawkeye remarked that it was a good name, likely passed down from honest forefathers. He confessed his admiration for names, though he thought Christian fashions fell short of native customs in this regard. He recalled that the greatest coward he had ever known was called Lion, while Lion's wife, Patience, had a tongue sharp enough to outpace a deer. Among Indians, however, names were matters of conscience. A man was generally what he called himself. Chingachgook, for instance, meant big serpent. Not that he was truly a snake, but that he understood the windings of human nature and struck silently when least expected. Hawkeye then asked Gamut his calling. The singing master explained that he was an instructor in psalmody, teaching sacred music to the youths of the Connecticut levy. Hawkeye, puzzled, pressed him further, asking if he could use a rifle or smoothbore. Gamut replied that he had never meddled with such murderous tools. The scout wondered if he could at least chart the wilderness with compass and paper, but Gamut denied this as well. Hawkeye suggested that his strong legs might serve him as a messenger for the general, but Gamut insisted he followed no calling other than his sacred vocation of music. The scout muttered that it was a strange life to go through the world like a catbird, echoing the sounds of others. Still, he admitted it must be Gamut's gift. No more to be denied than shooting was to another man. He proposed that the singing master show what he could do, as a friendly way of ending the night. The ladies, he said, needed rest for the hard journey awaiting them at dawn, before the Maguas were astir. David Gamut eagerly agreed. Adjusting his iron-rimmed spectacles, he produced his cherished little book and offered it to Alice. He declared that nothing could be more fitting than to raise evening praise after a day of such peril. Alice smiled, but when she glanced at Heyward, she blushed and hesitated. Heyward leaned close and whispered that she should indulge herself. He reminded her that the suggestion of the man who bore the name of the psalmist deserved weight at such a moment. Encouraged by Heyward's opinion, Alice yielded to her pious inclinations and her love for gentle sounds. The book opened to a hymn well suited to their situation, one in which the poet, freed from the urge to rival the inspired king of Israel, revealed a more restrained and respectable power. Cora showed a willingness to support her sister, and soon the sacred song began. David, ever methodical, prepared the pitch pipe and carefully set the tune before the voices rose. The air was solemn and slow. At moments, The rich voices of the sisters swelled to their fullest compass, filling the cavern with holy excitement. Then the sound would sink so low that the rushing waters outside seemed to weave through their melody as a hollow accompaniment. David's natural taste and true ear guided the harmony, shaping it to suit the confined space, until every crevice of the cavern vibrated with the thrilling notes. The Indians fixed their eyes on the rocks, listening with such intensity that they seemed turned to stone. The scout, who had rested his chin in his hand with an air of indifference, gradually softened. Verse by verse, his rigid features relaxed. His iron nature yielded as memory carried him back to boyhood, when he had heard similar songs of praise in the settlements of the colony. His roving eyes grew moist, and before the hymn ended, tears long absent welled up and rolled down cheeks more accustomed to storms of heaven than to signs of weakness. The singers lingered on one of those low, dying chords that the ear clings to with greedy rapture, as if unwilling to let them go. Suddenly, a cry rose in the night air. It was a sound neither human nor earthly, piercing the cavern and striking the hearts of all who heard it. A dreadful stillness followed, as though even the furious waters had been checked by the horror of the interruption. Alice whispered in fear, asking what it might be, and Heyward repeated the question aloud. Neither the scout nor the Indians answered. They listened intently, astonishment plain in their manner, as if expecting the sound to return. At last, they spoke together in the Delaware tongue. Uncas then slipped silently through the inner passage, leaving the cavern to investigate. When he had gone, the scout admitted in English that he could not tell what the sound was. Though he and Chingachgook had roamed the forest for more than 30 years, this cry was unlike anything they had ever heard. He confessed that he had been vain to think no voice of man or beast was unknown to him. Cora asked calmly if it might be the shout of warriors meant to intimidate their enemies. The scout denied it, saying the sound was unnatural and shocking, unlike the war whoop, which once heard could never be mistaken. When Uncas returned, his short reply in Delaware confirmed that nothing was visible outside and their hiding place remained secure. Hawkeye shook his head in discontent, but urged the others to pass into the second cavern and seek rest. They must rise long before dawn and make the most of their time to reach Edward, while the Mingos still slept. Cora set the example of obedience with a steadiness that encouraged the more timid Alice to follow. Before leaving, she whispered a request to Duncan that he should accompany them. Uncas lifted the blanket to allow their passage, and as the sisters turned to thank him for this courtesy, they noticed the scout seated once more before the fading embers. His face rested heavily in his hands, showing how deeply he brooded over the strange interruption that had broken their evening devotions. Heyward carried a blazing knot to light the narrow passage of their new chamber. Placing it where it cast a dim glow, he joined the sisters, who now found themselves alone with him for the first time since leaving the safety of Fort Edward. Alice, still shaken, confessed her fear of sleeping in such a place with the dreadful cry echoing in her ears. Heyward reassured her, insisting they first examine the security of their refuge before speaking of rest. He moved to the far end of the cavern, where another outlet was hidden by blankets. Pulling aside the thick covering, he breathed in the fresh air from the cataract. Beneath his feet, one arm of the river rushed through a deep ravine carved into the soft rock, its violent current plunging and sweeping with force. He judged it a natural defense against any danger from that side. Dropping the blanket again, he declared that nature had provided an impenetrable barrier, and with good men on guard in front, there was no reason to disregard the scout's advice. He urged the sisters to seek rest. Cora admitted the justice of his words, though she confessed she could not follow them. She explained that even without the shock of the mysterious cry, other anxieties would banish sleep. She reminded him that daughters could not forget the torment of a father who knew not where his children lay, in such a wilderness and surrounded by peril. Heyward replied that their father was a soldier, accustomed to the chances of the woods. Cora countered that he was also a father and could not deny his nature. Alice, overcome with emotion, broke into soft sobs. She recalled how their father had always been tender and loving, how they had been selfish to ask for this dangerous journey. Cora, with quiet regret, admitted that she might have been too impulsive in urging his consent. Yet her only wish had been to prove that, no matter how the world might forget him, his daughters would remain loyal and true. Heyward spoke with kindness, reminding them that when their father first heard of their arrival at Fort Edward, he had been torn between fear and love. But in the end, love, strengthened by years of separation, had conquered his doubts. He had even praised Cora's courage, saying that if every soldier serving the crown possessed half her strength, no enemy could ever prevail. And so, another chapter draws to a close, but the story is far from over. Every choice, every whisper, every heartbeat still echoes through the pages, waiting to be heard again. If this journey touched your heart or sparked your imagination, take a moment to support the channel. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions help us bring more timeless stories to life, one episode at a time. Join us again as we return to a world of courage, love, and destiny. Because every great story deserves to be heard and remembered.